Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy Guthrie, missing day 51. Tonight, one of her neighbors joins us to tell us his recollection of what went down that night and of his recollection of Mrs. Guthrie herself. Also tonight, mysterious ridges seen in the front of Nancy Guthrie's yard. What, if anything, do they mean, and were they preserved? This is a careful look at the porch guy video. Does it reveal headlights over his shoulder? And tonight, was a lockpick or a lockpick gun used to penetrate Nancy Guthrie's home? And can we analyze that and use it as evidence? Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us. The feds are now trying to question work crews on a construction site.
People just don't go in there and randomly dump stuff. They do have the thing broken up into grids. You have equipment that runs over the stuff to kind of pack it down, and that creates an absolute nightmare for investigators when they go out there to begin to search.
I'm very anxious to get to the ridges that were seen in front of Nancy Guthrie's home. Can I just see that very quickly, please, control room? As well as what's revealed by a careful look at the porch guy. Lights, possibly headlights over his shoulder. But first, I want to go to a special guest joining us, a neighbor of Nancy Guthrie's. It's Jeff Lemay, who woke up that night in the early morning hours, and he very often passes Mrs. Guthrie on their neighborhood strolls. Mr. Lemay, thank you for being with us.
For sure. Glad to be here.
You know what? I'm so glad you said that, because in my world of investigating and prosecuting nothing but violent felonies for so many years, you wouldn't believe it, Mr. Lemay, of how many people, quote, don't want to get involved. They don't come forward. They don't say anything. And they feel okay with that. I will never understand it. First, I'm sure the FBI has quizzed you extensively, but I just want to hear at the beginning of your encounters with Mrs. Guthrie when you would both be out strolling the neighborhood.
We would see her when we were walking our dogs. She had a dog at one time also, and greet her. She was just a person who lived here, a pleasant, wonderful neighbor. And we're so saddened, of course. Saddened isn't even the word. Heartbroken about what's happened.
I guess you're also fed up with the ghouls showing up in your neighborhood in hot pants and stripper shoes to take photos in front of Mrs. Guthrie's home. It's sick. But before I go off on a tangent that gets me nowhere and proves nothing, that night, Jeff Lemay, that night, what happened?
Well, preceding the event, there were some evenings where our dogs woke up, which was highly unusual. We don't know if there's a correlation. I know the FBI and the investigators have asked for cameras and camera footage. All the neighbors have shared camera footage and any recollection they have. But the next day, we were surprised when there were helicopters above flying through the neighborhood, a large response of sheriff's department, a volunteer crew of community members who do rescue in the mountains of hikers who came and scoured the neighborhood. And initially we were wondering what was going on. And then we found out it was our neighbor, which obviously is horrible.
Day 51. And just when it seemed like the case had gone quiet, everything changed. A neighbor finally spoke. When Nancy Grace went over the latest update, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another tip. This was the kind of detail that forces investigators to rethink the entire timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Before we go further, Crime Talk, I want to hear from you. Drop where you're watching from in the comments and make sure you subscribe if you're following cases like this. Because what came out on day 51, no one saw coming. For weeks, the neighborhood had been quiet, too quiet. People were interviewed, statements were taken, but nothing stood out enough to shift the case. Until now. The neighbor, someone who lived just a short distance away, came forward with something he hadn't shared before. Not because he thought it wasn't important, but because he didn't realize what he saw could be connected. That night, the night Nancy vanished, he couldn't sleep. He remembers looking out toward the street, sometime late, when most lights were already off. That's when he noticed movement. Not loud, not chaotic. Controlled. He saw a figure near Nancy Guthrie's home, not standing still, moving with purpose. Back and forth briefly, like someone focused on something specific. Not wandering, not lost. Intentional. What stood out wasn't just the movement, it was the timing. This was during a window investigators had struggled to fully account for, a gap in the timeline that had remained unclear until this moment. Nancy Grace pointed out something critical. The neighbor didn't report seeing a struggle, no shouting, no obvious signs of panic. Which raises a serious question. Was Nancy already inside at that point, or had something already happened? The neighbor also described something else. A vehicle. Not parked normally, positioned in a way that suggested it wasn't meant to be noticed, engine off, lights out, sitting just far enough to blend into the dark. And then after a short period, it was gone. No sound he could clearly recall, no headlights flashing on, just gone. That detail alone hit hard. Because up until day 51, there had been no confirmed witness placing anyone near the home at that exact time. Now there was. And suddenly, the case didn't look the same anymore. The timeline wasn't empty anymore. It had a presence. What the neighbor described didn't just add a new detail. It forced investigators to go back and re-examine everything they thought they knew about that night. Nancy Grace pointed out that the timing of the sighting lined up almost perfectly with the gap in Nancy Guthrie's timeline, the same window where her movements couldn't be fully accounted for. And that's where things started to get uncomfortable. Because the neighbor was clear about one thing, the person he saw didn't look confused or lost. They weren't hesitating. They weren't checking directions. They were moving like they knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. That kind of movement suggests familiarity, either with the area or with the house itself. Then investigators focused on the second detail, the vehicle. The way it was positioned wasn't random. It wasn't parked like someone visiting. It was placed just far enough away to avoid attention, but close enough for quick access. That raised a critical question. Was that person already inside the home at some point, or were they waiting for the right moment to approach? Because when detectives cross-referenced this with earlier findings, the unexplained phone contact, the unusual activity leading up to Nancy's disappearance, and the lack of forced entry, it started forming a pattern. One that didn't point to a random event. It pointed to planning. Nancy Grace emphasized that cases involving controlled movement and quiet presence often mean one thing. Whoever was there didn't want to draw attention, and more importantly, didn't expect to be interrupted. And then came another layer. The neighbor mentioned that the figure appeared to be handling something near the entrance area, briefly bending, shifting position, then standing again. That detail stood out immediately. Because investigators had already identified that same area, the front porch, as a key location based on the evidence found there. Now, the physical evidence and the eyewitness account were overlapping. That's when the case started tightening. If the person seen that night was the same person connected to Nancy's earlier contact, then this wasn't just someone passing by. This was someone who came with a purpose, and possibly left with more than they arrived with. By the end of the Day 51 update, one thing became clear. The silence around that night wasn't empty anymore. It had shape. It had movement. And now it had a witness. If you're following this, drop where you're watching from and tell me what you think. Was this someone who knew her, or someone who planned every move? By day 51, the case had already raised more questions than answers. But once the neighbor came forward, everything began to connect in a way it hadn't before. Nancy Grace explained that the sighting filled a critical gap in the timeline. For weeks, there had been a window of time the investigators couldn't fully explain. Now, there was movement, a person, a presence near Nancy Guthrie's home at exactly the moment things likely went wrong. The neighbor's description was specific: controlled movement, no panic, no noise. That alone suggested whoever was there wasn't acting randomly. It pointed to someone who knew what they were doing and possibly knew the environment well enough to move without drawing attention. Then came the vehicle. Positioned away from direct view, lights off and gone within a short time, it didn't behave like a normal visit. It suggested planning, timing, and a clear intention to avoid being seen. When investigators combined this with earlier findings, the case began to shift even further. There were already concerns about unusual activity in the days leading up to Nancy's disappearance, unexplained communication, gaps in her routine, and signs that something may have been arranged ahead of time. Now, with a witness placing someone at the scene, those earlier details carried more weight. Attention turned to how someone could have approached or entered the home without obvious signs of forced entry. That's where expert analysis came in. A lock specialist confirmed that, under certain conditions, it is possible to access a property using specialized tools without leaving clear damage behind, especially if the person had time and knew what they were doing. That detail aligned with the overall pattern. No loud disturbance. No immediate signs of struggle from the outside. And a situation that unfolded quickly. Then there were the markings in the driveway, subtle ridges that didn't match normal tire patterns. Experts suggested they could indicate a vehicle positioning briefly under pressure, possibly adjusting direction or stopping in a controlled way. Individually, each clue raised questions. Together, they told a story. A timeline where contact may have been established days earlier. A presence confirmed the night she vanished. A possible entry that didn't trigger alarm, and a departure that left almost no trace. Nancy Guthrie still hasn't been found. But the case is no longer standing still. Because now, investigators aren't just looking at what happened, they're looking at how it happened, step by step. And for the first time, that path is starting to take shape. If you've been following this, drop where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Because cases like this don't stay hidden forever.
Yeah, I think, listen, does this piece of video mean that there's an accomplice? Not necessarily. However, right, logic tells us that removing Mrs. Guthrie from the house, evading all sorts of detection throughout this process leads us to think there has to be more than one person involved, and that they would require a vehicle to move her away from her residence. 100%.
Hey, hold on, Fitz, look. Watch it again. He looks back directly at those headlights. See, did you see that? Wait, let's play that again in its entirety of this particular. See him look back? I did not notice that the first time. What about that, Fitz?
There's been a number of really good breakdowns done in the online sleuth community, seeing this, what appears to be some communication from the perp on the porch back in the direction of what appears to be headlights going off. So that is certainly, an interesting point there.
Brian, other theories have emerged that, and this is from a retired FBI, that there are up to 5 accomplices. I find the 5 to be unbelievable? Because with 5 people, somebody's going to crack, or some wife, girlfriend, neighbor is going to blab. 5, way too many. What's your thought?
I share that. With a $1.2 million reward and 5 people associated in a conspiracy, it's very unlikely that they can keep things that tight without somebody leaking information or going to law enforcement. I think it's more likely that 2 or 3 were involved here, at least a second person to bring up a vehicle, and 1 to make entry into the home and bring out Mrs. Guthrie.
Brian Fitzgibbons, you were listening as Jeff Lemie was describing that school kid cut through that was used. I find that very, very interesting.
Yeah, so this cut through, and you can view it and zoom in on the map, you would have pretty good concealment to move on foot to the southeast and gain access to Mrs. Guthrie's property from her backyard. That cut through seems relatively navigable at night, with that dirt road there, and would have good cover and concealment from cameras on the backyards of these properties.
Joining me now, Todd Shipley, digital cybercrime expert, former detective sergeant, Reno, Nevada, 25 years in law enforcement, author of Surviving a Cyber Attack, and author of Investigating Internet Crimes. You can find him at darkintel.info. Todd, you have been listening very carefully. Here's a question regarding your expertise. We know that Mrs. Guthrie had cameras in her backyard, including one up on a post. Do you believe there is more video or images to be found and they're just trying to recover them? Because we keep hearing shifting stories from nanos suggesting there's nothing else, and then suddenly there is something else.
Well, I think you're right. I think there is more to be gotten out of this. That's evident by the fact that they had this other video that they classified from January 11th that all of a sudden showed up. But I think one of the things about the current video and the lights you're seeing in there is the bias that law enforcement has shown in their review of that video. And I mean that they focused on the person in the video because that was what they see and didn't look at the background. And so oftentimes when we're looking at these things, we have to look at the bigger picture, and they didn't do that. They focused on the guy. They focused on that he had a gun. They focused on, what was up his sleeve, whether it was a watch or a tattoo, all these things, and missed the fact that there was something in the background that was there that came out through crowdsourcing by somebody on X or, through social media, which should have been one of the first things that they looked at when they looked at that video. What's going on? So there's a bunch of information I think that still exists that law enforcement hasn't either gotten to or has not released to us, obviously.
Todd Shipley, what is your other observation tonight?
Well, one of the things that we've not seen yet from the releases by the FBI or the Sheriff's Department is the metadata regarding these videos. Metadata is data that describes other data. When you take a picture, you take a video, there's data that is collected by the camera that describes who took it, what camera took it, the dates and times, sometimes geolocation. And so we don't have any of that. And I think that was why, at least initially, there was some concern about the January 11th date, is because there was something that indicated that date in a camera video at some portion, which we haven't got yet. So we don't know what that metadata is related to any of these videos or any of the pictures that have been taken.
Or think you know anything about Mrs. Guthrie's disappearance, please dial toll-free 800-225-5328, or to remain anonymous, 520-882-7463. Thank you to our guests joining us tonight, but especially to you for being with us and keeping the search for Nancy Guthrie alive. Nancy Grace signing off for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow night. And until then, good night, friends.